Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's conversation about the Aviator and the Showman, Amelia Earhart, George Putnam, and the marriage that made an American icon with Laurie Gwen Shapiro and Corey S. Powell. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Andrew Fairweather, and I'm a librarian here at SNFL. Before I start, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evenings possible. I would also like to remind you that if you don't already have a library card, it's easy to get one by visiting any information desk in this building. Finally, I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at the upcoming 7 Stories Up programs just like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new fiction, nonfiction, music, local history, and more. We would love to have you join us in this space again. And now let me introduce our speakers. Laurie Gwen Shapiro is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist whose writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, New York, The Daily Beast, Slate, and others. Shapiro is the 2021 winner of the Damn History Article Award for her New Yorker piece, The Improbable Journey of Dorothy Parker's Ashes, and a gold medallion winner in the People's Profile category of the Silurians Press Club 77th Annual Excellence in Journalism Awards. She is an adjunct professor at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute in the graduate program. And finally, I'd just like to say it's a thrill to be introducing her at NYPL's flagship location, as she's a personal friend of mine since my days at my former branch, the Seward Park Library on the Lower East Side. Corey S. Powell is an award-winning science writer, editor, and communicator. He is a former editor-in-chief of Discover and American Scientist magazines, and a regular contributor at Aeon and IEEE Spectrum. In his science outreach, he has collaborated with Bill Nye on 4 books: Undeniable, Unstoppable, Everything All at Once, and the upcoming Picture Guide to the Cosmos. 2 TV shows, Bill Nye Saves the World and The End is Nigh, and the Science Rules podcast. During the pandemic, he co-founded Open Mind, a Pulitzer-supported magazine that addressed science controversies and misinformation. He currently writes a column, Invisible Universe, about the layers of reality beyond human perception, and is working on a book of the same name due to be published by Harper One. Corey pops up all over science social media at Corey S. Powell. Without further ado, please welcome Laurie and Corey.
Oh, this is so exciting. This is my favorite library. I was just telling everybody, I grew up in this library.
Oh, and a great looking crowd. It's nice to see a turnout like this for an exciting book, and a book that has been in the works for a very long time. So you probably got from the introduction, Laurie and I have known each other for a very long time. And one of Laurie's superpowers is that she's an exceptional listener. That's how she finds so many stories. She'll have a conversation. She brings it to the reading experience as well. She picks up on a detail and then wants to know more and digs deeper and deeper. And I think that really comes through in the book.
Thank you.
One of my superpowers is that I am a terrible listener, which my wife is not in the audience, but she could definitely verify that. But it's a superpower because I will hear a story and enjoy it, and then the next time I hear the story, I don't remember any of the details, and I enjoy it all over again. And that's part of how Laurie and I think, have stayed good friends for so long, is it turns out to be a very good symbiotic relationship. But what it means for tonight is that I am going to enjoy this interview the same way that you're going to enjoy this interview, because even though Laurie and I have known each other through the creation of this book, there's still a lot that I don't know about it.
Yeah.
Or maybe I do, and I just don't remember.
Well, I'll bring you back.
Absolutely. So look, the first question, I just want to start big. Amelia Earhart is a very familiar, iconic personality. What made you think, oh, that's somebody who I want to do a book about? Maybe there's something new to tell there.
Well, I will start by saying that I am relatively new to narrative nonfiction, which is this genre. I had started out in publishing doing funny novels. I had a book in 1998 called The Unexpected Salami, true story, which was with Algonquin. And then I was sort of pushed a little bit into chick lit because I was pretty much too young to be writing books, but that was, you could pay your bills with that. And I had a lot of fun with that. At the same time, I was doing documentaries that were with my brother and then other people, and that were doing very big stories. Like we would film in the Amazon and New Guinea, and these were two different parts of my brain. And as I got older, I wanted to tell stories that had depth, and I actually wanted to write what I read. And what I read is narrative nonfiction. I read the New Yorker religiously. And I just, how do I get there? How do I make that jump? And I did that with a first nonfiction book in 2019 called The Stowaway, which was about a young man who was unknown, the opposite of Amelia Earhart, who swam across the Hudson River and went to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd, or who was Commander Byrd before he left. And that was really by trying to find a story, and I followed my luck. But what that did was a calling card, because it did pretty well. It got covered in newspapers, but I'm not a young spring chicken at this point, but I do have a track record. But I was able to say, look, I know this period of time. Now, Byrd he had a publisher named George Palmer Putnam. His other client of Putnam had another well-known name of Charles Lindbergh. So this is the era that I started to specialize in, 1928 to basically the end of the Jazz Age and the beginning of the Great Depression. And while I was doing The Stowaway, one of the things that happened is that I realized that Amelia Earhart is popping up in my story for a minute. She's flying over Admiral Byrd's or Commander Byrd's ship called the City of New York, named for maximum PR value by Putnam and his cronies, and they renamed the book. Everything was on these adventures were starting right here in Midtown Manhattan. The Putnam offices were on West 45th Street, right off Fifth Avenue. So literally right here is where this story begins. And after Byrd had gone and had his book, and people were doubting him, but there was Charles Lindbergh, and Putnam got his book called We. There's really nothing left except for a woman going across the Atlantic. So this is how we're going to talk about how Putnam meets Amelia. But one of the things I realized when I was doing my other book was when Amelia pops up, it is August of 1928, and my Stowaway is swimming in June of 28, which is exactly around the time that, in August of 28, but Amelia Earhart became famous in June of 28. By the end of the summer, she is incredibly famous. But what I realized doing a little bit of research, that she was also George Palmer Putnam's mistress, and he was married. And I realized that wasn't in my Scholastic book.
So this is the beginning of...
The beginning was...
There actually is more story
here.
The
beginning was, can I write an Amelia Earhart book for adults? That was the genesis of my thought. And then you put it in the back burner. You got to finish your book. You have to do your tour. And then when I'm talking to my agent, we were talking about this specific angle. Like, does the mystery of Amelia Earhart, to many, is how she disappeared. But to me, it was, who was she? I didn't know a lot about Amelia Earhart when I began this book, which I sold in November of 2019, before the pandemic. But when you do a proposal, you work on it for months before. So maybe like from June of 2019, I know a lot about Amelia Earhart right now. And I am probably the expert on Amelia Earhart, but that sense of, do I have the right to take on an icon? That was real. And what you do when you write a proposal is you dig around a little bit.
Yeah, I want to hear a little bit more about that digging process of when you realized, oh, I actually am finding things that people have not written about before, or people didn't know before. When did you start to feel like, okay, I'm actually seeing something unique and surprising here?
Well, some of the first hits I made were with people that had known both Amelia and George, who later on do get married after his marriage breaks up in 1931. So, but she's in an affair with him from 28 to 31. They are a partnership before that, and they're a partnership as marriage afterward. But I was seeing things that said, Amelia was a really good person. She's really brave, but she's flying above her ability. And that was pretty scary to read. I was like, oh, I was really worried that I was going to find out that she was like a secret Nazi like Lindbergh. You know, I want to tell you, don't worry. That doesn't happen here. But what was interesting were there was a man who was originally going to be her navigator on her last trip around the world. When she's hugging the equator, she's not actually doing one flight around the world. She's with Fred Noonan, and they're going as close to the equator as they can leisurely. And that was the first time around the equator. Wiley Post had already been the first person around the world. But that was the shtick. I can do this in New York. I'd say shtick. So that was the gimmick. The gimmick was, oh, she's going to do the equator. It was really for a book. The whole thing, everything about Amelia Earhart begins, ends literally because of publishing, book publishing, which is interesting because we're in a library. But I started to see people say that George Putnam was pushing her to get her book out for Christmas.
Okay, there's so many things to unpack here, including that Amelia Earhart has all of a sudden gone from being an icon of aviation to a celebrity and somebody who pushes book sales.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that she is an incredible person. Two things can be at the same time. You know, two things can be true. She's incredibly brave. She's the second person to ever fly across the Atlantic alone, male or female. She does very impossible tasks. Now, other women, no matter how anyone's going to like this, there were other women that were better flyers than her. But she had the push of a promotional genius at the assist, and he was promoting her as Queen of Aviation. And there's all sorts of nasty things that are going, behind the curtains of like, how do we get the rivals out of the picture, which happen to be very good women pilots that are being quashed. Not by Amelia so much, but by Putnam. But one of the things that's amazing to me is that it's the truth. And as I signed my deal, you then get money up front, not all of the book, but you get enough money to really start researching. And I immediately went to Purdue University, where most of the archives for Amelia Earhart are. That's where her husband donated archives after she disappeared, because he was on to wife number 3. He had, within months he had a girlfriend, and within 11 months he had a new wife who was a different woman, and she didn't want to live with a ghost, so he gets it to Putnam. It's very noble. It's still to this day the George Putnam collection, and the family has continued to donate stuff, but it's heavily curated. Look at the name of the collection. It's the George Putnam collection. The other major collection for Amelia Earhart people is in Harvard University, because Muriel, her sister, who was also an estate of some sorts, gave what she had to Radcliffe, which is now part of Harvard. So a lot of the stuff that we know about Amelia Earhart comes from those collections. So once I got the money, I was in a very different position than someone, say, who's a librarian at a storied collection like, say Purdue, or someone who's a professor who has a certain amount of money. I could go wherever I wanted. And one of the first places I went was to the New York Public Library. And I said, help, help. And I'll never forget this librarian who was at the Lions Library, as I call it, just that library across the street, saying to me, do you know about something called archivegrid.org? And if anyone here is someone interested in nonfiction, he's like, why don't you look to see what other places have archives? And you can look up online, and it started to list anything. If there's one letter in a collection in Texas, they have it. If there's New Zealand, they'll have it. And I noticed a collection that was at the University of New Hampshire. And meanwhile, though, the pandemic begins. So I race there, and my father dies. My father, who lived to see the sale of this book, he was 100 years old. I had an older father. He was very happy that I sold it, and I dedicate this. I don't dedicate the book, but I mentioned that in my book, that he was like, "Don't mourn me. You got to finish your book," which is his way of saying goodbye. But I was in New Hampshire when the next day they shut down the library, but I was looking at conspiracy theories, archives, so much nonsense coming out of his mouth, including checks for young girls that were claiming that Amelia was taken to Japan.
Well, hold on. So let's back up. What was in this particular archive?
Well, what was in it were material from Hilton Rayleigh, who is a very important person in the story. He was the person who discovered Amelia Earhart in Boston, and he was good buddies with Putnam. And this is all because of Archive Grid, that I was there. And all of a sudden, the conspiracy theorists had interviewed all these people in 1958 that knew Amelia Earhart and George Putnam. And no one had ever looked at it. No one had ever looked in these archives. And Hilton Rayleigh, I don't know if anyone here is a military buff, but later on in World War II, he becomes one of the heads of the Ghost Army, which is super secretive, where they use people like Ellsworth Kelly and to do like fake tanks and audio recordings. He's a super secretive guy. He kept a lot of secrets about Amelia Earhart and George, but he's telling this guy because he wants him to write a book. It's 1958. George is already dead, and he doesn't want to listen to him. So that was an incredible material. But what you probably will know is once you get on the beat of something, you start to hear more. And I started to hear the rumor that someone who was trying to prove how Amelia Earhart disappeared, because that's a whole nother story of how this shifts to a cottage industry of let's find Amelia's plane around 1958 or 59 with this guy named Paul Briand, that there was someone named Elgin Long, who recorded hundreds of hours of tapes with every single person that knew Amelia Earhart and George, and that he was using it for the plane.
When did you find that? Because
about 3 years in.
What an amazing trove!
Oh my gosh! And I was just trying to find this, and I was trying to get. But
wait, so you knew it existed, you just didn't know where it was?
Well, I later found out after looking around that the Smithsonian, Elgin died. I wrote an article about a kimono that Amelia Earhart had. I was trying to get closer to the inner circle. That's something that I do, is I write articles just so that I get more trust. And I was told it is at the Smithsonian, but it hasn't been digitized yet. So, which is great because it means that it's there in a public spot. But I kept flying down. Remember, I had that advance, so I was using it quickly to go to Virginia, put my face with a mask in front of these people. Can I get the tapes yet? And they're like, no, we don't have the staff. This is a public institution. It's a pandemic on. And my deadline of my book was ticking away, and I finally got the call. No one had ever listened to these tapes other than Elgin, who was really concerned with where the plane was, but I wanted the personal side of the story. I got the call that the tapes were going to be available, and I'm going to be the first to listen to it. Go. And I told my publisher, oh my God, there's 200 hours. Every single person in my book is on tape talking for hours. I have to listen to these tapes. I can't give you my book, which, if you know me, I'm a deadline freak. I'm really incompetent, so I do this by show my competence by hitting my deadlines, and it makes people think that I'm competent. And I was like, I can't miss my deadline. That's like my whole thing. And I said, but I really need an extra 6 months, which they gave me. And all I did was listen to these tapes for days.
I have to say, I mean, for people who are not used to doing research, it can be hard to evaluate what 200 hours of conversation means. But an hour of conversation, when you transcribe it, is usually something around like 12,000, 15,000 words. So if you're thinking about 200 hours of conversation, you're thinking about this. What is that? You're in like the million. In the million word category.
And I've written my book. so now I have to, do I explode my book? So what I was listening to, but the thing that was the gift is that I remember that moment when I felt like a charlatan, like, who am I to take on Amelia Earhart? This is at the end. I know who everyone is. If you listen to these tapes, if I randomly pick someone from this audience, and you wouldn't make any sense of it, because these are people, you might not know who these people, I knew who everybody was. And then I was hearing about stories that I hadn't heard at all, and I was hearing a new Amelia emerge. And that was when I really was able to write my book. And the Amelia that was emerging, would you like to know who the new Amelia was that I was emerging?
I would very much so. Could you tell me who the new Amelia is? That would be delightful to me.
The new Amelia was an incredibly ambitious woman. And one of the things about Amelia Earhart is that she's brave, but she wasn't blatantly ambitious, and she's modest and humble, and she's a killer in the best way. I love ambitious women. Raise your hand if you're an ambitious woman. Bravo, brava. I love him. But like, that's not palatable to a lot of people back then, even today. And the other thing is that she's very reckless. That really came across. And that she's kind. In 200 hours of tapes, I realized everyone loves her. Even her enemies love her. In 200 hours of tapes, I did not hear anyone say anything nice about George Putnam, except for his sons. We're saying, well, he was a showman, So that tells you a lot about character. And you realize that they were really a team. But the other thing that was amazing was I found things that no one has ever heard before. For example, her sister, these are not crackpot sources. This is like, the other wives of George Putnam are all on tape. That's pretty revealing. Amelia's sister is on tape for 2 hours. And the guy that's doing the interviews doesn't really care about anything personal. And his wife is there. And every time anything personal happens, she goes, oh, no, we don't need to hear that. And I'm like screaming, we need to hear that. But a little bit about me, and Corey knows my husband, but he comes from the music world and has an audio desk. And once I was able to get the links to the tapes, if things were scruffy and whispered, because Muriel, her sister, would whisper things, I would have him defuzz the audio and then amp it up in my house. And all of a sudden, I could hear
I'm just
Muriel.
picturing this is like an episode of CSI. Enhance, enhance.
And one of the first things I learned, which is that Amelia Earhart, who was engaged to a man named Sam Chapman when she met Putnam, a 7-year engagement, really didn't want to get married to Sam Chapman. She wanted to get married to this a millionaire, a billboard king of California who was 45 years older than her. And he was buying that car that she supposedly saved up for, this gold car, yellow car, that she drove across from California to New York. That was a gift. This was, for all intents and purposes, a sugar daddy. Amelia Earhart had, but that's okay, because that was the way he loved her flying. Sam Chapman did not want her to be flying. And this man went to her parents to ask him to marry her. And my witness to this story, I've heard somebody say, oh, I don't know where she's getting this from or whatever. It's her sister who met him, who said, oh, my parents didn't want her to marry a guy who's 45 years old, or even they didn't think it was appropriate. But what was really interesting to me, that tells you even more, because Amelia Earhart is 22, 23 when this is happening, and she's still having to have her permission of her parents to get married.
So hold on. So what happened to these two suitors? The one who she was supposed to be with, the one she wanted to be with?
Varney, who there's a picture of him in the book. I wanted to also do the research, and there's photos. I spent some of my advance to get some new photos. We see the same photos of Amelia. They're all Getty or whatever, library photos. There are photos of things that you've never seen are in this book. There's 2 sets of that, including George Putnam faking his own kidnapping, things like that. I mean, this is the story that was, you can see why this is not at the library at Purdue, And so I wanted to make sure that if I'm saying it, I'm going to show you a picture of her sugar daddy. You triangulate the truth, but there's also a visual story that you're telling through photos as well. But I think what was so amazing to me is that I realized very quickly that she was ambitious. Because I think she probably really liked this guy, but she wanted to fly. And here was a guy who loved her flying, who said, I love what you do. She already had a license in 1920. She was living in California. She had been in New York City doing pre-med at Columbia. They had a night extension or an extension program that women were allowed to go. She didn't love it. She went out to California. That's where she learned how to fly. But there was no way to get ahead without the power of a man, because the people that were getting hours and flights back in the early 20s had come out of World War I and were men. And they had hours and hours of experience. Women could do stunts here and there, but it was incredibly dangerous. So she changed the course of her ambition. She was always ambitious, but she decided, I'll go into social work. She answered an ad and realized that social work was a path forward. After many jobs, like she sold sausages, she was a photographer, she was a secretary. I mean, she's 31. I'm 59 years old, and I don't think of 31 as that old. But back then, it was like she wanted her life to count. And that had passed her by. Aviation, she still did. She was a Sunday pilot, or like a Sunday painter. She was, she got a few hours as a hobby pilot. But she had actually started to fly for the social work Dennison House in Boston, where she'd moved with her mother. And she was, because she would drop pamphlets about the social work, they loved her. I mean, that was sort of a great gimmick. And she was actually she had no money as a social worker. That was one of the things Putnam wanted to promise her. If you come with me, I will make money for you.
Right. But
she was rising. And Frances Perkins, of course, is famously someone who came out of Greenwich House and joined FDR's cabinet. So that was a way forward for women, was social work.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of your book is about this relationship between Amelia and George.
Yeah.
Where does George come into the picture? And is his entrance, is he a savior figure? Is he a manipulative figure? What's your take on him?
A manipulative figure.
Okay.
But a charming one. How many people have ever met a charming manipulator? Very well read. He was not the head of Putnam Books. That's something I always read that's always right. His uncle, George Haven Putnam, was the head of. He was one of 5 nephews. It was like a jazz age game of secession. There were 5 uncles. So most of the publishers that he was involved with were genteel 19th century publishers that were still in New York. They were all moved to this district. Right here where we are is where the new publishing district was. The genteel publishers moved first, like Putnam. Doubleday was in Garden City. You had Harper and Row. Those were no Jews allowed, by the way, none. So there were new publishers cropping up right around here. Knopf, Viking, Simon & Schuster. These were Jewish houses. You couldn't even get a job as a secretary in the other houses, but they were pushing the envelope, and they were starting to get market share. And Putnam wanted to bring his house into the 20th century. And he was trying to get in. He joined the Explorers Club. He led some expeditions. And he was trying to sign up exciting people and not just dry literary stuff, which I would read anyhow. But he had some major, major hits. When Amelia Earhart met him, and I will give you a little secret that there is a New York Times article in the works about Amelia Earhart's New York, which should be coming out in September. Today I was going to some of the sites with the reporter. When she met him, he was incredibly famous. He was Lindbergh's publisher. He was in the papers. He was the bold-faced name.
All right. So you described George as a charming manipulator.
He was also married.
But what about Amelia? Was she going into this with eyes open of who he was and what it meant to be with him?
Well, she had Hilton Rayleigh brought her from Boston. That was, there'd been a challenge. Does anyone know who Amy Phipps Guest is? So, okay, Amy Phipps Guest had money because she was the Phipps Steel, and she had wanted to be the first woman across. There were 7 women that tried before Amelia Earhart. People don't remember that. Most of them died. This was not, even to be a passenger was incredibly dangerous. And George Putnam had heard from Bird, his client, that Phipps Guest bought a plane. She was going to try to be the next passenger. She had millions and millions of dollars, about $1 billion in 2025 money. And her kids freaked out. They're like, Mom, you're not going across the Atlantic. Everybody's dying. And they came up with the solution that they would find a replacement. And she decided she wanted to do for England what Charles Lindbergh was doing for Paris, and let's have someone fly to England and make it an all-American woman, and not someone like this lady she was reading about named Mabel Bowl, who was called the Queen of Diamonds and wanted to go across, and she wanted to beat Mabel Bowl. And actually, when Mabel Bowl read that Amelia Earhart was going, she flew up to Newfoundland to try to be first. And so this motivation was to find a replacement, and Putnam had the in, and what his motivation was a book. So Amelia Earhart was going to be the next novelty book about a flyer going across, which was Putnam's genre. Not the whole publishing book firm Putnam, which was a very esteemed publishing firm, but the uncles had his books, and George Putnam had the Explorers. And he had the Adventurers, and he was looking for a woman to fill that next slot.
Yeah, to me, this is one of the really fascinating themes running through the book, is that it's not just about the history of aviation, it's not just about their relationship, it's also about the celebrity culture at the time, or maybe the birth of a certain type of modern celebrity culture.
You want to call her the first influencer?
Sure, I'll call her the first influencer. Yes, there we go. She was the first. She was the first influencer. Tell me a little bit about her look, because her look changed from her early days to when she was with George and being more of the public eye.
So Amelia, again, had been flying since she was 22, in the beginning of the jazz age, 1921. I mean, she's born in 1897, so she's probably about 24. She did have her jacket. She did have her boots. That's really Amelia Earhart's. That was her stuff. She had cut her hair to be shorter for flying, but it was more of a bob, like a jazz age. Now, one of the things that Hilton Rayleigh, who was a PR master, he also was the guy in charge of the bird expedition to Antarctica, which I'm an expert on that, if you want to have a side chat. But they were like, Amelia looks just like Lindbergh from a certain angle. So they started from the very beginning promoting her as Lady Lindy. And that wasn't something that the press came up with. That is something that was caught in a marketing meeting. And one of the things that George encouraged her to do, and there's these famous photos of her on top of the Boston Copley Hotel that were taken before Amelia was even known. She's about to fly from Boston to Newfoundland, where that was the shortest point across the Atlantic. And they encouraged her to cut her hair more like Lindbergh. So that haircut, that iconic haircut, was a marketing thing. But did she have those boots? Yeah. Did she have a flight jacket? Yeah. She was a pilot. That wasn't invented. But this whole thing about Lady Lindy was I mean, you have to give George Putnam credit. He was a marketing genius. Let's just give that to him, because he also did almost all of his books were ghostwritten, including Amelia Earhart's. Were ghostwritten by a man, the first one by Fitzhugh Green. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Penelope Green for the New York Times. That's his granddaughter, Amelia's ghostwriter. I've seen his archives. But he would get a book out 6 weeks after an event. Because who's going to... And that was a way to get it on the bestseller list. He also came up with little records. There's a book of Amelia Earhart's when she crossed the Atlantic by herself in 1932. A little record that's in the book, which was like a collectible. I have that book signed, which cost me about $2,000 to get the sign without but with the record, it's like $60,000 now. But that was a genius move. I mean, those instant books. He had a lot of really good photos in his book, so that there was a mass audience that went between teenagers and adults. I mean, he was really good at what he did.
So one of the most famous things about Amelia is, of course, the thing that she couldn't control, which was her disappearance. You've said a few things that kind of allude to your take on why and how she disappeared. That she was reckless, that she was bold, that flight was very, very hazardous at that time. That there were a lot of previous accidents, a lot of previous deaths. So the way you're describing it, her disappearance honestly does not seem that surprising.
No, I think that I want to say that she did a lot of records. She got to be a better flyer than she started out with. In 1929, Putnam put out that she had a fourth woman in the United States to have a transport license. She didn't. She got that in 1930. People that said that she didn't have it were called liars, but they weren't lying. The archives prove that. But she did start to want to go across the Atlantic. When she went across in 1928, she had a ticker tape parade, but there were two men that did the flying. She was not allowed to take control, and she wanted to show women that they could do that. She felt really badly that she got all this attention. The decision to fly across the Atlantic in 1932 is really that push to count, to inspire. 1937 is a very different story. That's the flight that she disappears on. And there's other flights in between that are very important flights that are in the book. But the ones that we really know her for are 28, when she's the passenger, becomes famous, 32, when she crosses the Atlantic alone, and 37, when she disappears on the way from Lae, New Guinea to the United States and disappears near Howland Island, where she was supposed to, which is the size of Central Park, which she should not have been doing this route. Now, on these tapes are people talking about her ability, including people like Louise Thaden, who's an incredible pilot, who is one of her closest friends, and saying that she just didn't have the hours because in 1937, there's a different change. We are in the height of the Great Depression. From 33, 34, 35, I mean, all of the way Amelia was the meal ticket for this marriage, and she would do lecture after lecture after lecture, and then there would be a book, and there'd be a stunt because you had to be in the news, and so there'd be a stunt. And so she wasn't getting the flight hours, and that's something that really, really worried her friends at the 99s. She was, at this time, a tremendous feminist. I will say that. She was the first president of the 99s, which were the 99 first women pilots. She didn't want to be the first president. Louise Thaden, who was the better pilot, was going to be the first president, but they realized together they're not going to get the press for this women's organization without someone like Amelia Earhart to get you in the tent. And she said, okay, I'll do it. And then she took her job very seriously and really pushed and had the back of other women. Now, there are other women that were really great pilots, like Jackie Cochran, who comes in the story later. They're really set on their own personal records. They're not pushing women up. I think Amelia is much more interested in showing that women can take the same chances that men. We don't think, Corey knows a lot about the space industry, that we don't really question the early astronauts that took those really early missions. They knew they could die.
Right.
But we don't think, oh, they're so reckless. She wanted that ability for women. That why do women have to answer why they're taking the flight? Wiley Post, who is one of our great pilots, also disappeared in an accident. Why can't I take that risk? Now, there are other women that are doing things like learning Morse code, or getting the hours of experience. They're better pilots than Amelia Earhart, but they're not. Their MO is not to bring women up. It's to bring themselves up.
There was something that you mentioned to me earlier that I found really interesting, that she was really determined to be piloting, doing her own piloting, to really, to show that a woman can be, in charge of an airplane, not just as a matter of rights, but as a matter of the actual physical ability of women to be pilots.
Yes, one thing that's really interesting is there's a woman named Helen Richley, who is in the story briefly, but she became the first woman pilot hired by an airline, and she lost her job. Pilots would not, that's when I say there weren't a lot of opportunities other than stunts for women. You could be a stewardess, but you couldn't be a pilot. And one of the things she was trying to do is, people would say that they menstruate. How could they be good pilots when they have their period?
Yeah, they go crazy once a month. How can you trust them in an airplane?
And she got on the bandwagon, did research on this. especially like when she was involved with Purdue University later on. The reason the collection went to Purdue University is later on in the 30s, George got her not only the plane, the Electra that would disappeared, but he got her a great gig at Purdue University as a consulting. And she wasn't a professor, but she would fly in and be there for about 6 or 7 weeks and work with young women to push them up through aviation. And Purdue is still one of the great universities for aviation, space as well as aviation. And I often say, if Amelia Earhart had survived the flight, I think she would have been very connected to the space industry. And one of the things that I always talk about is that there are many pilots and many people in space as well, astronauts, their hero growing up was Amelia Earhart. I interviewed some of the women astronauts. One of them is going back to the moon. Women are going to the moon. Her hero is Amelia Earhart. Now, here's the crazy part of the story, is that you don't get women going to the moon if we just left Amelia Earhart to her own devices. She wasn't going to be doing any of this. So we have this guy who fakes his own kidnapping, who pretends that Putnam Books is going to be blown up by fascists, who squashes teenage rivals, who's a complete Machiavellian character. And he gets Amelia Earhart famous. And she's partnered to this. She knows who this guy is, but it's her guy. And she's getting opportunity to take aviation risks and to show that women can do things. Her motivation is not just for money. Her motivation is to do the things that she wants to do without anyone telling her that she can't. And that takes money. And so that's what history looks like. History is not a perfect person, and this straight, and then we get this lovely hero. Amelia's not a bad person. That's what one of the delightful things I found out, is that she's actually a really trusted friend. But, the husband, not so much, But we don't get people going to the moon who are women unless we have George Putnam. And here are the other things you find out. Things like the 99s, which is this incredible organization to this day that took hold because of Amelia Earhart. Well, there was the 99 women pilots. But guess what? One of the things I found out, I went to 30 states with my advance money. My husband is not happy about that. But I went to Oklahoma with the 99s. I went through the archives. I spoke to librarians in Kansas. I went everywhere, Texas, Indiana, all Newfoundland. But one of the things I found out is that there were only 99 white women pilots. There were other pilots that were not invited to the 99s. It's a great organization. There's black women in it today. But that's what history looks like. Right. We have to tell the truth. If we can't take the truth about Amelia Earhart, how can we learn the truth how can we ask other people to tell the truth? And there's nothing horrific about her, but she's cheating on her pilot's license. She's not learning Morse code. She's, like this, things like that make a truer, richer story, I think.
Yeah. We should. I want to leave time for audience questions.
Absolutely.
I think we're just about at the Q&A time. Before we go to audience questions, though, I want you to just answer the question that everybody wants to know: Where and why did her plane go down?
How many people have a theory? Because I always joke that men explain Amelia Earhart to men, but there is. There's pretty good intel. There's a whole industry about people trying to find Amelia Earhart's plane.
Oh my God, is there an industry?
And some of it is just, I'm in New York, it's Michigas, right? But some of it, I think she was out of gas. Sometimes it's pretty boring. But to me, what's fascinating is that if she was out of gas, and there's tapes. No one has listened to these tapes before me and Elgin Long. There's tapes of the Coast Guard talking to her, like, not her voice, but talking about what it was like seconds before she went down. She has no gas. Her voice has changed. So where do I think she is? I think it's a spoiler because my book is not about how she died. It's how she lived. But I think, like most people who are reasonable, is that she ran out of gas and that she's somewhere in the Pacific. There are lots of different teams. There is one team that I think is pretty legit and called Nauticus. They don't put out press releases about what they found when they haven't found anything. They don't have hunches that they're the ones to see Amelia Earhart. That was some of the stuff. And but the Pacific is very, very big. So even if you look in a little spot, it's like looking at a pinprick. But what's really nice is where she's not is as important as where she is. And the Nauticus team has been doing this for 30 years, and they have a lot of information, and they've mapped out lots of places that she's not. And she's probably within 11 to 24 miles of Howland Island, probably to the northwest, if you want me to get exact. And what's really exciting is that technology keeps getting better. But one of the things that I found out while doing this research is that some of the propaganda was started by George Putnam to get money because he was broke. He thought he was marrying a wealthy heiress from Beverly Hills, and she thought she was marrying a rich publisher, and they were both broke. So he plants propaganda, and that's in my book how I cover that. And on top of that, there's a movie called Flight for Freedom in the 1940s that millions of soldiers saw, which was a propaganda film.
Is that the Myrna Loy one?
No, it's not Myrna Loy.
No, which one is that?
This is a film that was shot where there's Amelia-like character is going, Rosalind Russell, I believe.
Oh, okay.
She's spying for America. It was shown, everyone might know that Catcher in the Rye was not a big hit. No, it's not Catcher in the Rye, Great Gatsby, but it was given to 1 million soldiers. The same thing. This movie was seen by 1 million soldiers. Many of them were very upset about Pearl Harbor. There was a tremendous hatred of the Japanese. Amelia Earhart's death becomes much more important in 1941. In 1937, the Japanese were helping search for her. In 1941, her death becomes very useful propaganda. And to this day, there are people that will say that she was taken by the Japanese. She had no gas. And also, on top of that, there are researchers that have won the Pulitzer Prize in history, like William Manchester, who would say, whose father was there when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And he would say, oh, everyone knows that she was taken by the Japanese. So you can't even trust a Pulitzer Prize historian. One of my great heroes in the New York Public Library.
Stay skeptical, in other words.
Yeah, in the New York Public Library, at the Performing Arts Library, you're all here, so you can go see it, is a script that one of my heroes, another Pulitzer Prize winner, Pete Hamill, wrote about her capture in Japan. And Shirley MacLaine was going to play Amelia Earhart. But he later on married a Japanese woman who had debunked everything, and he changed his tune. But I'm just telling you, don't even go by the people that have Pulitzer Prizes in history. You've got to do your own research. There's a saying in journalism, if your mother says, I love you, fact check that.
All right, that is a great segue to audience questions, so we can find out whether, while people are interrogating their hearts about whether or not their mothers love them. Yes.
I do have mic. Hi.
Hi.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm one of those people that read The New Yorker, which is endless, and every week that it comes, it's like, oh no, more stuff to read. But I read the book review of this book in The New Yorker.
Oh, the excerpt. It was excerpted in The New Yorker.
I found it fascinating. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that the guy that they had her fly with was an alcoholic.
Yes.
So you can say something about that. And also that she left without really having the proper equipment to do proper information. So that's why I'm here, because I was so fascinated by your book and reading it in The New Yorker.
Well, thank you so much. One of the things I will tell people is one of the most brutal experiences is to be fact-checked by The New Yorker. They had 2 fact-checkers on me for 14 hours a day for 7 days, and I made it through, because you don't get anything. People say, oh, where did that come from? It's like, listen, you got to go to talk to my fact checkers on that. Much of that material about the alcoholism, which is very controversial. Fred Noonan has everyone know the name Fred Noonan? Amelia Earhart wasn't the only person that disappeared on July 2nd, 1937. There was a navigator. His name was Fred Noonan. This was the second time around the globe. She had tried in March and ground looped in Hawaii. So this was, the Howland Island was going to be first, and now it was going to be towards the end, which is, on the tapes, Louise Sadin says, Amelia wanted to wait until the right time, but George was pushing her to get the book out. So that's right there. That's her best friend. The second thing that happened is that there are a lot of tapes of Fred Noonan's colleagues at Pan Am. He was a tremendous navigator. He was the best in the business. He did something called celestial navigation, which we don't use, but he used the skies. He got Amelia Earhart to Howland Island. But that island was like in the Pacific. They looked like clouds. It was really hard to find, but he was also someone who was fired from Pan Am for drinking. He came cheap because the first navigator, Harry Manning, quit. And there was a junior navigator named Fred Noonan that was brought on, it gets in the book. But he becomes the lead navigator because Putnam said he's inexpensive and he's a great navigator, but he was an alcoholic. And so they start out the flight, they're doing okay, but on tape are the people in New Guinea. Remember, no one's listening to this before me, except for Elgin Long, and he's not writing about everything because he wants to do a proper story. But basically, he's looking for how the plane crashed. But Noonan was drinking heavily 2 days before. He started drinking in Indonesia. They were not getting along at all, and Amelia Earhart's father was an alcoholic. The first flight that she went across, the pilot, Wilmer Stultz, he died from alcoholism in a crash. She could have died, and Putnam knew when she was on that 1928 flight. She was throwing alcohol out the window. So she didn't drink, but she took him on a trip, and all these people are on tape, not just one person, that the woman that owned the hotel, the people that were drinking with him. Oh, he was doing scotch. And so she takes him to a little indigenous town in New Guinea for a field trip to keep her eyeballs on him, to make sure he's not drinking. So my personal take is that he was not drunk on that flight, but 2 days out. But they were not getting along. That's not necessarily why they crashed, because you also, on these tapes, you hear people from the Coast Guard saying, she was so close, I opened the window on the Itasca, which was the Coast Guard cutter that was stationed.
She was flying low?
No, she was so close to Howland Island, they thought that she was there. I mean, he got them there, and there was a storm. So Noonan is even whatever their relationship, but everyone had told her, other pilots had said, this is a crazy place to land. The Pacific is crazy, and you don't know what the clouds look like. And a little island the size of Central Park could look like a cloud. And there's gas. It takes a lot of gas to go from Leh to Howland. It was in the middle of the Pacific. It was like a stop before she got back to Hawaii. So if you did it first, the way the original flight was, you're healthy. She also had dysentery. So this is not good.
I hate to stop you while you're on a roll. I want to try to squeeze in at least one or two more questions.
Absolutely.
But I hate to stop you on dysentery, because I feel like that could be. I feel like that could go so many places.
Here, I have this one here.
Sure.
Around 10, 15 years ago, a plane was found which created a big to-do in the news world. That you don't believe was that not documented? Okay.
So just recently, I read in the New York Times that they found remains of an aircraft, and it was uncovered in a storm.
Buka?
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
No. Okay.
I love the ones that produce the short answers. It really opens up the conversation.
She had no gas. No, I'm just telling you, that's why the Nauticus team, actually the Romeo team, which was last year, where they thought they found it, I was told by the Nauticus team, it's a log. It's a rock. It's a rock. Which a year later, it is a rock. But they love the fact that these people they're friendly with each other, because it brings Amelia Earhart to the news, and it helps them raise money for their own expeditions. And one of the things that I learned at the Amelia Earhart's birthplace in Atchison is that there was a woman. There's a wonderful museum that just opened up, the Amelia Earhart Hangar Museum, which has the only other 10 lecture 10E. I was just there for the Amelia Earhart Festival, which is 50,000 people every July. But there's another museum called the Amelia Earhart Birthplace Museum, where she was raised. A woman who's no longer alive was telling people she came back. And there's people that go out there saying she came back. And the reason she was doing this was to build tourism to Atchison, Kansas. So controversy, but like things like, she didn't really figure this out. She didn't have Morse code skills. There's not enough gas. That's a little less interesting, but to me, that's why her life is so interesting.
Well, yeah. Well, this is the thing of being a celebrity and an icon, is that everybody wants a piece of you, even now.
Exactly.
Can we can squeeze in one more? Can we try to get somebody from back here? Yes. I think, sir, you're probably the furthest back.
Hi.
Hi.
It just occurred to me. What do you think happens if they find the plane?
Oh, this is a tremendous discussion that I've had with a number of people. Who owns the plane? Does Purdue University own the plane? Does it go to Purdue? Does it go to the Finders? Is it American history? Does it go to the Smithsonian? Who gets the money from it? I mean, one of the things you can talk about with these expeditions is to follow the money. Who gains from anything being found? There's also movies that are trumped up, like Nat Geo specials of like Amelia Earhart's plane. What really happened is she ran out of gas. I mean, I hate to be that person, but I want to be your voice of. But the person, Elgin Long, who did the tape, who was like the Columbo of the air. I mean, he did 200. He was so OCD. I love him because he did these tapes. But he's like, she ran out of gas. He's
I just have to jump here. I saw the Star Trek episode. She was abducted by aliens. Okay.
One of the things that was in research papers, I did so much research. I want to give a shout out to the New York Public Library because they have a program called the Allen Room if you have a book contract. And even during the pandemic, I was able to have an office here, which you share with other people, but it's free, which is an amazing perk. But I was able to get lots of help from librarians, being an Allen scholar. People like Robert Caro were the real scholars and stuff were there. But one of the things I found were dissertations are fantastic and scientific studies. And there was one study that was done shortly, a couple years after the Star Trek episode. Does everyone know that episode? Which Star Trek was it again?
It was Star Trek Voyager, where she gets to meet Captain Janeway, for those of us who are science fiction nerds. And she was the first historical figure to appear in Star Trek, not as a hologram or a recreation, but actually just playing herself.
Well, this is funny because about 5 years later, this just goes to show you there was a scientific study, which I got through my librarian help at the New York Public Library. 8% of Americans believe that Amelia Earhart was abducted by aliens. And it was backed up by another scientific study. Now, that number has faded because, the memory of the Star Trek. I feel
that's also a useful number to keep in mind when you read polling and you read all the weird things that, that 5 to 10% of Americans believe. You can get 5 to 10% of Americans to believe almost anything.
Exactly.
All right, that's all the time we have. Laurie's going to go out and sign some books.
Absolutely.
And
thank you, everybody, for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces, too.